I call the meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 22 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development.
Je déclare la séance ouverte. Bienvenue à la séance numéro 22 du Comité permanent des affaires étrangères, du développement international de la Chambre des communes. Conformément au paragraphe 108.
A point of order, Chair. There's no interpretation.
Okay. The committee is resuming its study of Canada's Arctic strategy. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. I'd like to now welcome our witnesses for our meeting today. From the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, René Wallet, Director General, and Paul Lind, Assistant Director. Up to 5 minutes will be given for opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions from colleagues. And I now invite Mr. Lind to make an opening statement. Welcome.
Thank you. Mr. Chair and honorable members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Paul Lind, and I am the Assistant Deputy Minister responsible for intelligence collection at the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, or CSIS for short. I am responsible for the management and oversight of all regional collection activities and operational capabilities, both foreign and domestic. I am joined today by René Wallet, Director General of Engagement. CSIS investigates threats to the security of Canada in order to protect Canada's prosperity, national security, and the safety of Canadians. Our work in the Arctic is guided and informed through cooperation with federal, Indigenous, and territorial partners. The economic and strategic importance of the region has been steadily increasing, along with the diversity and tempo of threats to Canada's national security. Protecting Canada's Arctic sovereignty and security is more critical than ever to Canada's prosperity and national interests, as well as North American continental and maritime security. Contemporary threats to the Arctic stem not only from the growing militarization and the effects of climate change, but also increasingly from espionage and foreign interference activities, including through cyber means. CSIS seeks to help enhance Canada's resilience against various threats in the region, and our mandate with respect to the Arctic includes, but is not limited to, investigating activities in the Arctic and North that are suspected to be threats to the security of Canada, taking steps to mitigate or reduce these threats where possible, advising the government and partners in the region on these threats, and engaging with Indigenous governments and organizations, the private sector, and the public, among others. Contacts and relationships built over time with Arctic communities and the different orders of government have resulted in valuable threat-related information being shared proactively with CSIS. The unique insights and experiences that Arctic and Northern partners bring to CSIS help us better understand the threat landscape as it relates to the region and its people. As commercial and international interests in the Arctic have grown, the number and diversity of threats to Canada's security and sovereignty in the region have also increased. CSIS has intensified its focus and efforts to investigate these threats. Canada's Arctic sovereignty is long-standing and well-established. This includes the waters of Canada's Arctic archipelago, including the various waterways often referred to as the Northwest Passage, which are internal waters of Canada by virtue of historic title. Governments, Indigenous people, and local communities across Canada exercise Canada's enduring sovereignty over its Arctic lands, ice, and waters every day. CSIS is building on strong, trusted relationships with key partners within and outside the government and like-minded Arctic states to share information and coordinate efforts with respect to the Arctic. This includes providing relevant information to help inform decision-making and to build and maintain resiliency against threats to the region. We have been sharing information on the threat landscape with territorial and Indigenous governments and partner organizations across the Canadian Arctic and North. We will continue to work closely with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis organizations and governments to support decision-making in relation to resource development on Indigenous peoples' land. For example, we have provided multiple briefings on critical minerals, economic security, and the activities of hostile foreign state actors to empower partners with relevant national security insights to consider as part of the decision-making processes. Our engagement with Indigenous partners is aligned with the commitment CSIS made in the Action Plan for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, to share information with Indigenous partners to support informed decision-making and self-determination. As CSIS pursues our mandate in a complex, dynamic, and challenging environment, we remain committed to doing so in a way that aligns with the government's Arctic and Northern Policy Framework and Arctic foreign policy. As part of these efforts, CSIS maintains an evergreen internal Arctic and Northern Framework. It aims to ensure a strategic and coordinated approach to CSIS's engagement in the Arctic and North, and to underscore our commitment to collaboration with government and Indigenous partners, especially those who make their home in the region. While CSIS was not involved in the 2019 FAAE study on the Arctic, we are glad to contribute to the new study and very much appreciate the invitation today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lind, for your remarks. I will now open the floor to questions, beginning with my colleague, Member of Parliament, Ziad Abul Taif. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Lind and Mr. Ouellette for attending before committee today. The Department of National Defense October 24th, 2024 report titled Evaluation of Arctic Operations found that there was no military threat to Canada's territorial sovereignty. However, we know that state actors, primarily Russia and China, are trying to gain a foothold in the Arctic. The first question is, China is known to use research vessels for scientific activities and espionage. How does CSIS monitor, evaluate, and respond to these activities?
Thank you for the question. So CSIS focus, when it comes to threats to the security of Canada, particularly in relation to the Arctic, are focused on espionage, sabotage, foreign-influenced activities that are clandestine or deceptive. And when it comes to the research vessels, the threat you mentioned is multifaceted, and so we use a number of methods and approaches in order to collect that information. One of the our primary focus of engagement in the Arctic recently has been trying to build resiliency and cooperate with Indigenous partners, territorial governments, and local communities in order to be able to forge those kind of connections so that they can be aware of all the threat-related information that we're aware of, but more importantly, too, they have more visibility on these threats and on these activities. And so they're in a position to be able to inform us when they see something.
How have Russia's operations specifically in the circumpolar Arctic developed over the past few years, especially since the invasion of Ukraine?
So I would say from a CSIS perspective, the activities of Russia are still a concern. Russia has a tremendous interest and focus in the Arctic. However, they are of less concern than, say, the activities of China and other hostile state actors at this time. That's not to say that they're not of concern. As you mentioned, since the invasion of Ukraine, there's been a number of international sanctions against Russia, which has limited their ability to be as effective in their intelligence collection activities as, say, they were in the past.
Is that because of a previous understanding to our position as Canada in the Arctic and our interests versus the Russian, since the Chinese do not own any part of the Arctic, as we know? So could that situation with Russia that is different than it is with China due to a previous understanding, let's say, between Canada and Russia on the Arctic, or agreement of some kind?
I'm not sure if I understand the question completely, but what I would say, Mr. Chair, is that in response to that, the concern with Russia is more of a military-focused threat in terms of intelligence collection to support military efforts, as opposed to other hostile state actors, where the concern would be more about economic security.
Okay. So the sovereignty of Canada's Arctic waters are of paramount importance. What attempts have been made by ships affiliated with China, Russia, and other countries to enter Canadian waters illegally, and how have we responded?
So I think that may be a question that might be better placed for other government departments or possibly national defense to answer. From a CSIS perspective, we are focused on espionage, sabotage, and foreign interference activities as they relate to the Arctic. And so the tracking of ships would be one element of that, but it wouldn't be the primary focus or element from a CSIS perspective.
So I agree to part of your question, part of your answer, but in the meantime, how do you measure your activities when it comes to change of operations and circumstances, such as the development in the last few years, where we start to see and feel that the threat coming from Russia and China for the Arctic is larger than ever. So how does CSIS react to such thing? And are you prepared enough to be able to cover the areas and to cover the information needed so we are well aware?
So I would say the vast size of the landscape is absolutely a challenge, which I believe is what you were alluding to as well. But yet CSIS is regularly traveling to the region. We are regularly collecting information on threats to the security of Canada. We are regularly conducting investigations up in the Arctic and outside of the Arctic, because not all threats to the Arctic need to be investigated within the Arctic. And so I would say the service is regularly engaged on these threats and regularly collecting. You had mentioned part of your question was how do we evaluate and measure our success? Well, I would say one of our primary focuses over the last couple of years has been this enhanced engagement. Our legislation changed about 2 years ago that allows us now to share more information more widely with partners, not just the federal government partners, with territorial government, with local communities, and with Indigenous partners. And so in doing so, there's two objectives of that. One is to make sure that these partners have all the relevant threat-related information that we're aware of so they can build resiliency and protect themselves against a threat, but also so that they can also be our eyes and ears and provide us with that information. So, sorry, one way of measuring our success is that we have had these partners proactively contact us with information of concern about the behavior and activities of threat-related actors. And so I would say there's a positive development right there.
So United States is a partner in that fashion. How does it look like the degree of collaboration now with the United States compared to the one before President Trump took over a year ago?
Very brief response, if possible, because we've just run out of time.
Sure. You're correct. The United States is still a partner. We have, decades. We've been partners for decades. Despite some of the unpredictable behavior, I'd say, at the political level at this time, at the intelligence department level, we still work lockstep and hand in hand with each other, and it's in our interest to continue to do so on both sides.
Thank you very much. Next is MP Stephen Guilbeault. You have 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Lynn.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Lynn and Mr. Ouellette. We're very pleased to have you with us today. My first question, my apologies.
Vous m'entendez maintenant? Est-ce que la
Can you hear me now? Is the translation coming through? Oh, testing. Is the translation coming through? Can you hear me now? Is it coming through? Good. Okay. Apologies. That's fine. So, Mr. Lynn, in your presentation, you mentioned the fact that in the report of 2019 from the committee from the intelligence service, it was not part of their work at the time, and you're talking about that now. Did you talk a little bit about that? I'd like you to develop on changes in terms of the threats that we have been observing in recent years in the Arctic, particularly, let's say, in the past few months.
Thank you for the question. So the changes that we have seen in the last few months, changes since the 2019 study, I believe, is the focus of your question. I would say now our primary concern about the threat in the Arctic falls under economic security, about its foreign interference in our economic sector. It's manipulation, attempted manipulation in a clandestine or deceptive nature of our economic policies, attempts to disrupt, interfere with, or control our economic decision-making. And this is where we've seen an increase in, at least our concern in the threat-related activity would be from an economic security perspective.
Merci. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You referred to earlier in response to the question from Mr. Baitaib about collaboration with other federal government departments, for example, defense, and you didn't talk about it without mentioning it. Natural Resources Canada, could you go into the type of collaboration that are intelligence people have with other federal departments on security?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. So we take an all-of-government approach to protecting the Arctic. So we are engaging with a number of other government departments, all of the government departments that are operating in the region as well too, in order to share the threat-related information that I had mentioned earlier. So we're trying to build resiliency in the local communities, but also share our awareness and understanding of the threat with as many of our federal partners as possible, and look for ways to both support and amplify each other's mandates.
Merci.
Thank you. You also spoke several times about collaboration with industry, Indigenous communities, and local governments. Without going into detail or secrecy, could you give us an idea about how that collaboration with those various entities can be done, including those stewards of nature or rangers that occupy the territory, where it's more difficult for us to do so? Could you give us a few examples of this kind of collaboration?
Yes, thank you for the question. So some examples would be sharing with those that operate critical infrastructure in the north, in the Arctic. And so ensuring that they have an awareness of the threats, ways they can protect themselves, ways they can be more resilient against those threats, and also ensure that those pathways of communication are open and strong so that they can report back their concerns and their insights as well too.
Pardon. Et donc, ça implique, par exemple...
So this would involve the fact that they can communicate with you, and you can also communicate with them at certain points when you identify a potential threat?
Yes, effectively, yes. It's so that we can, we have a pathway for communication. From our perspective, it's to make sure that they're aware of the threats that are being directed against them, and to help provide advice or awareness so that they can better protect themselves and mitigate that threat.
Perhaps I can respond regarding, well, traditionally our partners in the North and the Arctic were our federal partners traditionally, because the threat was directed primarily toward the main partner. We had advice with those ministers, and the threat now is more focused on other levels of government and other sectors, research and private sector. So this forces us to broaden our pool of partners to provide information to those that have the authority to make decisions and protect themselves against those threats. Perhaps one last question, Chair. I imagine that one of the threats that is increasing is the cybersecurity type of threat or digital type threat. Can you say whether there are ways of working with our partners, for example, local governments and communities, to equip them to deal with those threats?
So thank you for the question. One of the ways is building that resiliency I mentioned, making sure that they're aware of the threat. But there are other government departments that also have that sort of expertise. So CSIS, for example, the Cyber Center, making sure that making sure the local infrastructure and these partners are aware of who to turn to and where they can get that threat-related information, and making those connections between other federal government departments and those being targeted.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Next, we go to Monsieur Duceppe. You have 6 minutes.
Mr. Duceppe. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Lynn. Welcome to the committee. Mr. Ouellette, welcome. Thank you for being here. We heard the speech by Donald Trump about Greenland, which focuses primarily on the Chinese military threat. When we talk about Greenland and the Arctic, some experts say that we're on the wrong track if we focus only on the military threat from China. And I think that Director Daniel Rogers stated that non-Arctic countries such as the People's Republic of China seek to enter the region for strategic and economic reasons. I'd like to hear you about real issues of the aims of China in the Arctic. Isn't the challenge more to do with gray zones such as data gathering and the potential use of those data that are gathered?
Thank you for the question. I would say it's a multifaceted threat. It's not just data collection and worrying about what they would do with the data. Some of the concerns we have, as I mentioned before, are with economic security, with predatory foreign investment. It would be of a clandestine or deceptive nature. And so you mentioned China. China is in strategic competition to control critical minerals, control supply chains. By some accounts, they already control between 60 to 90% of that, depending on what you use to measure critical minerals. And so the concern we have would be with clandestine or deceptive investment practices or economic engagement in certain market sectors in the Arctic. And so from a CSIS perspective, we investigate, collect information on that, and we advise government on the risk and the threat. And do so under the Investment Canada Act, which is a very powerful tool. It allows us to provide security advice and recommendations to government so they can make informed decisions on those investments.
Merci pour cette réponse.
Thank you for the answer. There are some experts also who state that when states want to work with China on critical infrastructure, it can create a certain vulnerability then. When China develops relations in the field of port infrastructure, airports, and energy, it gives them leverage, which they can utilize whenever there are conflicts, whether economic conflicts or political conflicts. And then wouldn't you see, well, I'm not going to align the question that way, but what would be your view of the recent diplomatic spat and trade issues with Canada and China if we legitimize what I just said in the preamble?
Thank you for the question. What I would say is that there's no such thing as anything that's zero risk. So this is the issue. The basic risk management practices, I'm sure many of you are aware. You review something, you determine, you measure what the risk is, and you put as many mitigations as possible, and what you have left is a residual risk. And with the residual risk, you either accept it, you transfer it somewhere else, or you further mitigate it. And so this services perspective is we would investigate any security threat to national security to Canada. We provide that advice to government. That is but one input of a number of inputs the government needs to weigh and measure in order to make informed decision making. And so with the recent trade engagement with China, what I would say to that is that CSIS will continue to provide the government with economic security considerations and advice on national security so it can weigh those different inputs and make informed decisions.
Vous avez parlé plus tôt.
You also spoke earlier, Mr. Ouellet. You were talking about this, the fact that you have communication with different levels of government because the situation demands it. Did you feel that there were any attempts to influence from hostile state actors, let's say, for local political stakeholders, or not only political but economic stakeholders as well?
En effet, c'est une des, on perçoit des.
That is indeed one of the things. There are efforts by certain foreign countries that have disinformation campaigns to try to divide the population. As regards the federal government, we all understand that there's the history between the Crown and the Indigenous people in the North, and it's a complex history. And we work closely with our Indigenous partners in the North to try to mitigate efforts of hostile foreign governments to break the trust in the work that we've been doing recently. So what I understand then is that there's a risk of the improper use of history that was horrible, but nevertheless that is being restored. I understand. So you have, well, it's a question you don't have to answer, but have you seen any attempts to do mapping of the critical infrastructure on our territory by hostile governments in the Arctic?
Thank you for the question. And so Without getting into specifics, what I would say is it's something that we would be alive to and be focused on and would investigate if it came to our attention.
Thank you very much. We're going next to the second round of questions, and we'll go next to MP Majumdar Shuv. Welcome to the committee. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And I have a lot of questions, and I was hoping we could, as best as possible, approximate yes and no answers, but I understand that some nuance is required. My first question is, do you think that China is the greatest principal threat to our Arctic sovereignty?
I would say it's a primary threat, yes.
And what about airspace and subsea? Do foreign actors pose significant threats in those domains as well?
I think foreign actors can pose significant threats to those as well, too. I'm not as informed enough to be an expert on those areas, but it's definitely something that CSIS would investigate.
Has CSIS identified Chinese or Russian attempts to map, survey, or access Canadian subsea regions?
I do not have that information available at this time. I'm not in a position to make an informed response.
Okay. How about, are there ongoing efforts that you may be aware of by China or Russia to collect intelligence on Canada's Arctic region?
Yes.
Okay. Is Canada's Arctic airspace fully secure against foreign incursions or surveillance?
Again, that'd be a question that would be outside of the mandate of CSIS. I wouldn't be in a position to provide an informed response.
To the best of your knowledge, have foreign aircraft conducted incursions or surveillance activities in Canada's Arctic region?
Again, I'm sorry, but I'm not in a position to be able to respond in an informed manner because I don't know.
How about drones, satellites, unmanned systems currently being deployed by foreign actors in the Arctic? Is that ever comprise part of the threat analysis you conduct?
Yes, that would comprise part of the threat analysis. We would actually investigate that area.
And have you any notion of whether that's been happening in the Arctic?
I'm unfortunately not in a position to get into any specifics right now, and I apologize, but I'm not able to provide an informed answer to that question.
How about, have China or Russia engaged in activities that undermine Canadian Arctic sovereignty?
Yes, China and Russia have engaged in those activities.
And are there Chinese or Russian Arctic activities occurring that are not immediately visible or publicly declared to the best of your ability?
I believe there's activities going on at all times, and yes, I would say that there's some that are not fully public at this time.
You mentioned economic security as being a principal threat for how China compromises Canadian sovereignty, Canadian IP, Canadian advantages. Are foreign actors using commercial, scientific, or research platforms to conceal strategic Arctic operations?
I think all of those vectors are a possibility to be considered, and the CSIS would be interested in investigating the potential for all of those to be used in the manner you described.
And are there Arctic activities being conducted in ways designed to avoid clear attribution to China or to Russia?
That's at the very heart of foreign interference, is that it's clandestine and deceptive and meant to hide the true connection to the hostile state actor.
So do gaps exist then in your best assessment in Canada's monitoring capabilities that could allow covert foreign activity to go undetected?
It's hard to answer that question in the manner that it's been posed because when you mention in terms of detecting covert activity, as I mentioned, CSIS is constantly investigating threats to the security of Canada in the Arctic and across the country. The degree to which there are gaps, it's hard to characterize a response to that question because we are aware of what we're able to detect. We're not always aware of what may be going on that we have not yet detected.
To the best information you're able to glean from your own analysis, government colleagues across other agencies, partners, Five Eyes and otherwise, are any of these gaps in deterrence in Canada's Arctic strategy being directly and disproportionately exploited by Russia or by China?
So I'm not, apologize, it's a difficult question to answer because I'm not informed on any specific gaps that I'd be able to use as an example that are being exploited. But I would say that it's quite likely the possibility exists that there are different gaps in our approach that are being exploited by hostile state actors. For example, we mentioned the Investment Canada Act, which is a fantastic tool, allows us to provide security advice to government, make informed decisions. If your question is that act and that tool capturing everything? Well, the answer would be no. There would likely be opportunities, and we know hostile state actors are looking to exploit and work around areas that would prevent them from triggering a notification under the Investment Canada Act.
So our
Thank you. Sorry.
Okay.
14 seconds over. So we'll go to the next questioner, Anita Vandenbel. Do you have 5 minutes?
Thank you very much, and welcome to the committee, Mr. Ouellette, Mr. Lind. I'd just like to carry on about what you were talking about earlier about the information sharing. And it's this, I understand, two-directional information sharing. You're sharing with Inuit First Nations communities, and they are also then providing information back. To what extent are you also engaging researchers, scholars, academics, given that yesterday we announced a new Inuit university? How would they play into the information networks that you have?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, to a large extent, part of our our approach in the Arctic and North has been to speak to those who live there, but also who are expert scholars and researchers in the area as well. Our focus is in a number of areas where we would speak to university college administrators who design policy around research partnerships, for example. So to speak to them about the threats that might come with hostile states seeking to engage in partnerships for state purposes other than that which they are mentioning, and then with researchers as well who can provide us insights in sort of the history, culture, languages of the North and of the Arctic to help us better understand the region, to be able to then feed back information that will be relevant to them.
And of course, once the Inuit University is there, that would be a...
Yes, we look forward to them. We meet with a number of scholars as well. We participate in sort of conferences, workshops, panel discussions where we are openly speaking with folks that would be involved in the setup of these places. Yeah.
Thank you. We know that D&D has declared that climate change is a national security threat. We know that the Arctic has 70% of our coastline. To what extent are you looking at climate change and all of the related changes in the North as a security threat?
We're aware of the implications of climate change could have on towns, obviously on populations, and so on. But in terms of the threat itself, if it's not conducted by a foreign state in terms of kind of an espionage activity or foreign interference activity, it's not necessarily something that we would investigate per se. But obviously the implications of climate change are significant, and we're aware of them.
And of course, with ports potentially opening up, and the kind of infrastructure, which actually leads well into my next question, which is about you talked about the threats to critical infrastructure, and in the course of this study, we have been hearing from those in the North that are looking to have more infrastructure, for instance, data centers, where because of the cold temperatures, the land, the proximity to water, and potential ports. To what extent would that then, of course, create more targets, more threats to the infrastructure in the North if we expand that?
So I'd agree. It will. Those data centers would contribute to the threat environment. Hostile state actors would target them as they would any kind of critical infrastructure or any data. We do know that hostile state actors have an interest in collecting personal data and harvesting it. Some of these actors actually have some very advanced and sophisticated big data programs where they are just collecting as much personal data as possible and then using AI to sort through that data and using it to retarget back individuals of interest. So it would absolutely contribute to the threat environment. And from a service perspective, this is where we mentioned the resiliency briefings would be important to us, is that we would want to engage with those centers. We'd want to provide all the information that we have available on the threat and help them become resilient to it.
And that's, of course, the same no matter where, like, it wouldn't matter if they're in the north or in other parts of Canada, that threat is similar in all areas? Yeah.
Yes.
Mr. Chair, I've still.
2 seconds. Yeah.
So in 42 seconds, the increased attention and interest in Greenland, to what extent is that changing a lot of your analysis and the way in which you're looking at the threat environment?
So I would say it's a bit of a complicated environment. Obviously, everyone wants stability in the world. I'd say CSIS is focused on threats to the security of Canada directed at Canada or against Canadian interests. When it comes to Greenland, the Prime Minister's been very public that we stand strongly with Denmark and Greenland and the right for them to determine their own sovereignty. Service remains aware of it, but again, our efforts are focused on threats directed at Canada or against Canadian interests.
Thank you very much. We'll next have Monsieur Duceppe, 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Earlier, you told us that China is the main or one of the principal threats to Arctic security. In answering my colleague, you also said that one of the dangers is that data collection, that is sensitive data, used as a weapon in a sense. We've just signed a deal which is going to bring 49,000 highly intelligent electric cars, and those cars are connected to servers in China. So how can we justify such an agreement when CSIS, as you've just said, not only with China, which is one of the primary threats, if not the primary threat to the Arctic, but on top of that, one of the weapons they use, so to speak, I think we're a long way from the Arctic here. We're talking about electric cars in the Arctic. No, I think I'm on topic. I'm talking about the main threat of China and the Arctic. Cars sold to thousands of kilometers further south. I'm trying to find the connection, Chair.
Get a little bit more latitude, but to get to the
On
point.
parle de... J'espère que j'ai pas perdu de temps, puis je veux pas...
I hope I didn't lose any seconds, but on the point of order, I'll respond to the point of order, first of all, for Mr. Guilbeault, just so you can understand what I'm doing. We're talking about primary threats in the Arctic.
And I just want to assure the member that you have not lost any seconds.
Donc, je reprends où j'en étais rendu. Comment vous...
So picking up again, you've told us that the main threat in the Arctic is China, and vehicles are being brought in which are connected to servers in China, and we're being told that China is using data gathering of sensitive data as a weapon. So how can you justify such an agreement? And doesn't it make you worry and CSIS to see those vehicles entering our territory here in Canada?
Thank you for the question. As I mentioned before, one of CSIS's roles is to provide advice to government on all the security considerations, the economic security considerations, so that the government can make the best informed decision possible. And as I mentioned about mitigating risk down to the level where you have residual risk and you decide whether you can accept it or whether you need to further mitigate. And so this is a decision more for government decision makers. What the service will do, the service will investigate, provide advice on the threat and on the activity, and then allow the government to use that information to make the best decision possible about the way forward.
Merci. Sur les...
Thank you. As regards, we talked about critical minerals. We know that the Arctic is loaded with them. In your opinion, is that the main target, not just for China, but of any hostile state that would undermine Canada's Arctic security?
It's a factor, and it's an important factor for us to consider and keep in mind in terms of Canada's Arctic security. You know, we need investment. I'm sure this committee's heard a lot about the infrastructure up there, the desire for investment. And so from a CSIS perspective, again, we'll conduct investigations, identify threats, advise government, and allow decision makers to use that information about what would be the best decision.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will go next to MP Kramp-Nyman. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Earlier testimony, you had mentioned that Russia is not much of a military threat as other actors. Aside from China, who are those other actors?
Thank you for the question. Unfortunately, I'm not able to get into specifics. I don't want to leave the impression that Russia's not a threat. I would just say that it's more the concern with Russia is more from a military perspective than it is from an economic one.
Drawing on my recent visit to Greenland and many conversations I had with Arctic partners, and also I was by the Joint Arctic Command Center, I'm curious, is CSIS concerned and aware about the messaging that working with authoritarian regimes like China, the UAE, Qatar sends to our security partners, particularly our Five Eyes allies, and how that perception could affect intelligence sharing, trust, and that of cooperation?
So thank you for the question. We work very closely with a number of international partners. We have robust information sharing policies that respect all of our international obligations. And so I would say from an intelligence perspective, our focus still remains on threats to the security of Canada, and this is how we engage other partners. And we have not run into any issues or concerns in terms of those engagements with our foreign allies on any of our intelligence matters.
Thank you. Is Canada's Arctic early warning systems fully modernized?
I'm sorry, I don't believe I'm the best placed person to answer that question.
Okay. And do you believe Canada's current Arctic strategy achieves deterrence of Chinese and Russian ambitions?
So from a CSIS perspective, again, I would say all of our activities are completely aligned with the Arctic foreign policy and our Arctic strategy. As per the intentions and the effect of the Arctic strategy, I don't believe that CSIS is the best place to be able to answer that question.
Okay. Was CSIS at all consulted specifically on the security risks of closer economic integration with the authoritarian regimes prior to any agreements made with China?
So one of CSIS's roles is to provide security advice to government, and so it would be natural to do so. I'm not informed on that specific question, so I'm unable to give you a proper informed response.
Okay, thank you. Is there a danger of authoritarian regimes like China using current public sentiment toward the trade dispute with the United States to whitewash their public image?
So I would just encourage the member to kind of focus your questions to the Arctic because broader trade relations and the public image of a particular country is not what we're looking at today. So
okay.
let's get
I was
into
drawing
I gave
into
you
the
some
economic
leeway.
security.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Could you please speak to the actions that you think the Canadian government or CSIS thinks that the Canadian government can do specifically to protect our economic sovereignty in the North?
So thank you for the question. What CSIS's contribution to this, as I mentioned before, is that we investigate threats to the security of Canada, espionage, sabotage, foreign interference. We take the findings from those investigations and provide that information to government, but also territorial governments, municipal governments now, and local partners. And so what CSIS is doing to protect and contribute to the sovereignty is exactly that, is the resiliency, is sharing this information more widely than we've done in the past, and building and fostering that trust and helping build resiliency in the Arctic communities.
So are there any further additional protections, plans, processes that are currently in place to mitigate any threats that closer economic integration with China may present?
Well, CSIS will continue to investigate these threats where they surface. Part of our act allows us to undertake threat reduction activities and mitigate the threats where appropriate and where possible, and the service will continue to do so. We'll continue to share the information on these threats with local communities and territorial governments, which will help contribute to mitigating the threat.
So in earlier testimony, you spoke about IP theft. There was questions about economic espionage, infiltration by agents of governments and commercial institutions. Can you speak further to that, and how does Beijing and Moscow pose these threats to Canada outside of straight military threats? Can you expand on that?
Yes, thank you for the question. So it's multifaceted. They pose these threats through a number of ways. And so foreign interference is a good example. It's an attempt to, could be manipulating public opinion, manipulating people who aspire to higher office through coercion as well, too, through covert financing. From an economic security perspective, it's also investing using proxies or using disinformation or economic coercion. And so as long as there's a clandestine and deceptive nature to it, it would trigger under our mandate and allow us to investigate.
Thank you very much. Next, we go to MP Mona Fortier. You have 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et merci beaucoup d'être ici aujourd'hui pour
Thank you for being here today to clarify some questions that we have here in connection with this study that focuses. I'd like to know whether you observe an increase in cyber spying, cyber espionage, or digital espionage operations.
Les communautés autochtones ou les entreprises privées.
Sorry, I lost the translation.
The ARC, for example.
Si vous voyez une augmentation des activités de cyberespionnage ou d'espionnage numérique, il n'y a rien.
Yeah, we'll have to.
Cyber espionage. There's nothing. Testing one, testing. Is the interpretation coming through? Testing. This is the interpreter. Testing once again. Can you hear me? Is it working now? Yes? Excellent. I'm sorry I didn't lose my time, did I, Chair? No, not at all. All right. So,
une augmentation des activités de
start once again. An increase in cyber espionage or digital espionage against organizations that are active in the Arctic, such as against territorial governments or communities or even private businesses.
So thank you for the question. I don't think we're best placed to provide the best answer. I think CSE would be in a better position to respond to that question. But what I can say is that we are absolutely concerned with cyber attacks in the north and cyber attacks against both the private sector and against government entities up there as well, too.
Peut-être ajouter, si vous permettez, c'est aussi
If you will allow.
moins protégé aussi que les réseaux fédéraux. Donc,
the national government levels are often less protected than the federal. So we know that there's a heightened vulnerability, but you put your finger on the kinds of topics that where we can approach
confiance et de peut-être mitiger un peu contre l'historique, surtout avec des gouvernements autochtones.
Again,
and to mitigate of history, particularly with Indigenous governments.
For the benefit of the translators. But is it back now? We can so we'll try one more time. Yeah, okay.
Testing is interpretation on testing. I was just saying quite simply that having topics that we can approach our partners on.
Leur offrant de l'aide, évidemment, permet de bâtir la confiance qui assure la relation, le succès de la relation.
Parce que nous avons
to ensure the successful relations, because we received 2 territorial premiers who came to share that they don't have all the necessary resources. So it's important to mention that the federal government can play a role in order to ensure that we have this awareness and analyses or watchdog approach that can assist them with their mandate, as well as private businesses and I imagine even Indigenous communities. The reason why I asked
ou est-ce que les outils nécessaires pour pouvoir bien faire votre travail dans le contexte
question is to find out tools necessary to your job properly in the context right now.
We'll suspend for a very brief period to turn to MP Mona Fortier. You have 2 minutes and 20 seconds to continue your line of questioning.
Merci. Alors, je reviens un peu au concept.
Thanks, Joe. So I'd like to come back to the concept to understand whether you have all the tools or instruments necessary to be able to do your work in the context we're currently experiencing, where there's a lot of change You talked about the Investment Act, which is an instrument that you have to work with, but are there any things we ought to know, particularly the Arctic is a huge area. There's a lot to take into account in the context of your work. I'm trying to explore to find out if there's anything that we as a committee ought to know about that.
Thank you for your question. So, yes, we have the tools available, but it is not without challenge. You mentioned the vastness of the area that we have to cover. And so we do send employees regularly into the region, and we do engage with partners, premiers' offices, as often as possible to be able to provide those briefings. But there are a number of challenges, absolutely. The cost of travel. We don't have a permanent presence in the Arctic ourselves right now. We are absolutely committed to supporting the communities in the Arctic. And we're constantly looking at options at how we could enhance our presence in the Arctic. And so this is one of the major challenges. We do go regularly as often as possible. We've steadily increased our trips to the Arctic over the last number of years as well, too, in order to have these engagements and be able to share that information that we mentioned.
Parce que si je comprends bien,
Because if I understand correctly, you can't necessarily have contracts with other businesses to do your job for you. It's that complementary aspect that must be very difficult. When I was chair of the Treasury Board, there were certain things where we could contract out, but I imagine you cannot do that. You really have to keep the issues inside of your organization.
We do work very closely with other government departments in the Arctic as well too, and look at ways that we can that they can help us accomplish our mandate, and we can support them in their mandate as well too. But it is a challenge given the vastness of the area to cover. But we do work very closely with other government departments as well too. But you're correct. We can't subcontract this out to anybody else, but we do leverage our partners for support.
and just a question, question de précision. Quand vous
Just a clarification, when you say governments, are you referring to other countries or really within the federal or the government of Canada?
Canada, c'est ça, oui.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We start the third round of questions, beginning with MP Michael Chong. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing. Mr. Lind, in your opening remarks, you mentioned the growing threat of foreign interference particularly in the economic sector by the PRC in the Arctic. The Prime Minister said last year that the biggest threat to the security of Canada is China, particularly its foreign interference. And earlier in your testimony, you said something with respect to the PRC being a primary actor, and I'd like some clarification. Is it the assessment of CSIS that the People's Republic of China is the primary threat to the security of Canada, including its foreign interference in the Arctic?
Thank you for the question. I would say the PRC is among the primary threats to the security of Canada. And it's absolutely a threat actor that we are concerned about in terms of threat-related behavior in the Arctic.
Okay. Could you enumerate what the other primary threat actors are to the security of Canada? If the PRC is one of them, which other states are other primary threat actors?
Excuse me, sorry. So as we've mentioned a number in our public report last year, when it comes to the Arctic, the two primary actors we tend to talk about the most are the PRC and Russia.
Okay. In your opening remarks, you also said you were working with like-minded states and against hostile foreign state actors. You later clarified that the service is working lockstep and hand-in-hand with your U.S. intelligence community counterparts. Clearly, the U.S. president is talking in a way, political rhetoric, as you said, that threatens the sovereignty of Arctic states, including the Kingdom of Denmark and Canada. What I conclude from your testimony and what we're all watching out there on a almost daily basis is that the political rhetoric is not percolating down into the U.S. intelligence community that you work with. Is that correct?
I would say it's correct that, yes, we work still closely with our intelligence partners in the areas we're aligned. And
in other words, you're not siloing them in terms of collaborating on Five Eyes intelligence with respect to Arctic security.
that is correct. We're still working closely.
Understood. Thank you very much for that clarification. The CSIS director, Daniel Rogers, has said that non-Arctic states, including the People's Republic of China, seek to gain a strategic and economic foothold in the region. I think we have a pretty good idea of what the economic foothold they seek to gain is, but could you talk a little bit about what kind of strategic foothold they seek to gain? In other words, could you be a little more pedestrian about what a strategic foothold is? What are we talking about here in terms of a strategic foothold? We're talking infrastructure, we're talking, clandestine agents or proxy agents surveilling in the Arctic region. What do we mean by they're seeking to gain a strategic foothold?
Thank you for the question. So I would say it would cover all of the things you just mentioned. And so economically speaking, investment in critical minerals, predatory market investments, attempt for supply chain control, but also, which also gives them access to the area as well too, access to infrastructure, a foothold in the region is really.
Could you maybe talk a little bit about the kind of infrastructure, the kind of critical infrastructure that they're seeking to gain a foothold in? What are we talking about here? There's not a lot of infrastructure up in the region. What kind of infrastructure are we talking about? Cyber infrastructure, energy, diesel-fired electrical plants, runways. What infrastructure are we talking about that they're seeking to gain control in?
So from a CSIS perspective, the concern would be all of the above. Like as you mentioned, there's a lack of infrastructure in the Arctic, and there's a lack of redundancy for some of the infrastructure that exists. It's rather sparse. And the concern from a CSIS perspective is dependencies, control, and access to that infrastructure.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. We go next to Stephen Guilbeault. You have 5 minutes.
I think that there are a lot of questions that have been brought forward. I just have a few additional questions. So you identified the Investment Act as being one of the tools that you work with. If you wanted to suggest, and I understand how delicate it is for someone in your position to make suggestions to the government, we're not the government, we're elected officials, we're the legislative branch. If you have a few recommendations of how we could improve some of those tools, for example, the Investment Act, what should we look into if we want to bring improvements? I don't want to close you in or cause you any trouble either.
So thank you for the question. It's a good question. I am not an expert on the Investment Canada Act, so I wouldn't be the best person to be able to respond to that. But I am sure that there would be people that be able to identify, based on some of the observations we have, where the gaps could be and make recommendations. But I'm unfortunately not in an informed position to do so.
My colleague has more meetings, talked about more meetings for that issue. So a number of us have asked questions about partnership with Indigenous communities and governments. Would there be some way to tighten up the ties or improve how we work with them to improve their protection, for example, facing the threats, whatever threats they might be, cyber threats among others, or digital threats, or whatever type of threats? Would you have any recommendations to improve the protection of those organizations? Thank you for the question, sir. One aspect in the advice we give the government on the Arctic and the North is the reality that everyone is aware of, that there's a lack of infrastructure which causes an indirect risk of national security if the communities are vulnerable and the infrastructure is not sufficiently advanced. then they would be in a position of wanting to perhaps accept foreign investment that would make them even more vulnerable. So we often tell the government that the shortage of critical infrastructure and infrastructure in general causes an indirect risk to national security. Thank you. I don't have any further questions, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We go next to Monsieur Duceppe. You have 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Vous avez,
Thank you, Chair.
considérant que
Considering that the threats in the Arctic are increasing and hostile actors are taking more and more actions, I'd like to come back to the question from Mona Fortier earlier regarding your presence. You said that you don't necessarily have a permanent presence. I understand that it's happening now, but isn't there, is it a lack of funding, a lack of resources, a lack of training? Or if it's not a lack like that, do we need more training, resources, or money?
Thank you for the question. Like all government departments, we've had to allocate our resources across the country in a way that maximizes impact. And so it is a resource issue at the current time. What we have done is increase our travel from our offices that are not in the Arctic by sending employees much more regularly and much more frequently into the Arctic as often as possible, not just the territorial capitals, but also into the smaller cities as well. But it is related to the allocation of our resources to be able to have maximum effect across the country.
Et là, je veux pas faire mon grand.
So I don't want to overemphasize this, but we talk about tightening up the relations with the community. Isn't there perhaps an idea that could come out that it's within those communities that we could find resources that might become permanent and assist you not only in having a greater presence in the territory, but also with people that are very familiar with that territory?
Thank you. I completely agree. Ideally, we would have offices in the Arctic, in the territorial capitals. The way the service is structured now, we have offices across the country in the provincial capitals, everywhere except for PEI. And ideally, we would have similar office structures up in the Arctic as well.
So then we would solve, maybe not solve, but at least improve two shortcomings. First of all, the permanent presence of the organization on site and also relations with those communities. If some of the people from those communities work on a permanent basis for the service, if I understand correctly.
Yes, yes.
Okay, merci.
Thank you.
Plus d'autres questions. Merci.
Thank you.
To MP Michael Chung, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, Canada's had for decades intelligence sharing and collaboration as a member of the Five Eyes network, two states of which are clearly Arctic states. Recently, obviously, other Arctic states have been threatened by, the increased malevolent activities of states like the PRC and the Russian Federation in that sphere. I note that the Government of Canada has signaled that it is going to be establishing foreign and security partnerships with other Arctic states not members of the Five Eyes network, such as Finland, for example. Can you tell us if if there's anything flowing from these recently announced security partnerships that involve CSIS, and whether or not CSIS is now more actively collaborating and sharing intelligence with states like Finland, Norway, Sweden, and the other Arctic states not members of the Five Eyes network?
So thank you for the question. The answer is yes. Without getting into specific countries and organizations, I can tell you that CSIS is amplifying its partnerships and relationships with other countries, particularly when it comes to the Arctic. we're enhancing our information sharing, our approach to jointly ensuring mutual security of Arctic issues. So yeah, CSIS has been engaged and has progressed some work in relation to those international commitments that you mentioned.
Yeah, and in other words, this flows from the strategic or the security partnerships that the government has announced in the last year or two.
Yes, so those partnerships always existed, and we were always sharing with our partners. But we have looked for ways to continue to enhance and progress and strategically progress some of those partnerships.
Okay, in other words, intensify the collaboration and information sharing. Okay, understood. Thank you. I appreciate that clarification. I have a question regarding dual use type activities in Canada's Arctic from malevolent state actors such as research. Can you talk to us a little bit about the kinds of the nature, the form of these dual use activities from malevolent state actors in the Arctic region?
Yeah, sure.
A couple of sort of obvious examples would be research partnerships involving that maybe flows from sort of climate change concerns. So how the passageways are evolving. A lot of that research would involve sensors, for example, that are placed in the region. Those sensors are collecting information about various different things that are related to that legitimate research, but also collecting information about other kinds of movements in the region as well that could be of use to a military or an intelligence capacity of a foreign country.
With respect to Arctic research, particularly Arctic research funded by the four granting councils, the tri-councils, and the Canada Foundation for Innovation, I know several years ago there was concerns that money from the Government of Canada was flowing into research collaboration that involved malevolent state actors or their proxies. The Minister of Industry at the time issued new guidelines, I believe, to the granting councils to ensure that that money didn't flow into these partnerships. Does this funding of research, as it relates to things including climate change in Canada's Arctic, does that remain a concern for the service, or has that largely been addressed through the actions taken by the Minister of Industry previously?
I mean, it's obviously remains a concern, but the policy and legal responses to the problem that we had identified kind of in the 2020 kind of time frame, there has been a lot of investment within government and with research institutions themselves to allow them to avail themselves of research security expertise on their own, and we are very tightly connected with those entities as well to keep sharing information about the nature of the threat, exactly as is mentioned here.
Okay. I know that CSIS in the last budget, the last Trudeau government budget, was allocated resources to hire, from what I recall, hundreds of new agents in the Greater Toronto area, in particular to counter foreign interference threat activities in that sphere of, in that area of the country. Is CSIS ramping up its resources in the north as well?
So as I mentioned earlier, there are resource considerations to be able to ramp up in the north. And so we don't actually have specific funding related to ramping up resources in the north.
Is that a request of CSIS through the budget process?
A current request of CSIS right now? I'm sorry, I'm not in a position to be able to answer the question.
Thank you very much. We are over the time. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your appearance and your testimony before this committee today. We're very appreciative. We will now briefly suspend to prepare the last report.
Chair, can I just, before we're going in camera, I assume.
Actually, there's one more member.
Okay.
Yeah, but go ahead.
Well,
yeah, we'll go to MP Fancy. You have 5 minutes, and then we'll suspend. Yeah, sorry.
Oh. All right. Well, thank you very much, then, Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for today. I just had a couple of quick questions in regards to the intelligent gap, and then looking towards future legislation and what CSIS's role will be in helping us develop that. So, in terms of intelligent gap, what further details do you think that you can provide the committee about the multifaceted nature of security threats to the Arctic overall?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry. ma'am?
Yeah, so we're looking at some further details for some of the stuff that we've talked about today that you could provide us in terms of the multifaceted nature of security in the Arctic, in terms of the intelligence gaps that we have currently.
Maybe I could start with that. Thank you for the question. I think it's fair to say that the service believes that it has most of the authorities that it requires for specifically related to the Arctic. I think we're very happy to be here today to speak to this committee to shine a light on the issues and the threats that are manifest there. I think probably going back to the questions that we answered earlier, just to speak about infrastructure concerns, the social economic concerns that are raised there, I think is something that would certainly help mitigate national security threats that are facing the region.
So outside of those kind of infrastructure gaps, in terms of what other key tools then, and legislation can be part of that, do you feel that CSIS needs to help strengthen national resilience in the Arctic?
What I would say, one of the key tools is that change to the CSIS Act that occurred a couple of years ago that allows us to actually share information, resiliency briefings, we call them. The fact that we can now share the findings of our investigations, the threats, with wider partners and not just small sections of the federal government, I think has been a tremendous tool for the service.
Nice. And any other tools or authorities do you feel like in our legislation that we should be providing to help you do your job? I'm giving you the wish list here.
Yeah, I would say right now, I believe we have the tools necessary to be able to do our job and to be able to investigate those threats and to share that information.
Nice. So moving on, and in regards to, I know colleague Mr. Chong had talked about allies and partnerships. So our foreign affairs ministers recently met with our Secretary General to NATO. And my question there in terms of our partnerships, what role do you think that CSIS plays in contributing to these allied partnerships as we kind of grow and build them across the threat environment, across the Arctic?
So I would say these partnerships are extremely important because it allows us to share information on the threat from our different perspectives. It allows us to look for opportunities where we can work jointly against the threat, where we can jointly mitigate the threat, share training opportunities, have discussions about capabilities, different capabilities that we may be able to amplify or support each other in terms of working against these threats in the Arctic.
Nice, thank you. And lastly, to help wrap up, what role do you feel that NATO allies play in enhancing Canada's own awareness of a threat environment in the Arctic?
So thank you. I would say it's my answer would be similar to the last one, is that I think the role those allies play could also help us in terms of sharing information on the threat environment, looking for opportunities where we can work together to be able to counter some of those threats. As I mentioned, not all threats to the Arctic happen in the Arctic. Some of them happen outside of the Arctic. And so these allies could be very useful and helpful to us in terms of being able to have impact against those threats and not necessarily have to do that in the Arctic.
Nice.
Can I just clarify a point I made earlier as well? When you asked about authorities, I wouldn't want to leave the impression that we don't that the CSIS Act can't use some modernization. I think we all agree that it can. I think what we were trying to point out is that the modernization that would come to the CSIS Act would apply equally to the Arctic as anywhere else. So these are sort of regional agnostic kind of authorities that we think could stand to be modernized, and we will provide our advice to government on that on those measures as well.
Wonderful. That's everything I had.
Thank you, MP Fancy, and thank you once again, gentlemen, for appearing before the committee and for your testimony.